Now, RadLab had a very similar problem with what they were. They didn't have lasers in those days, but they had very good oscillators. These are electromagnetic tuning forks, in effect. These are things which give a very beautiful output signal it's at a very high frequency for radios. It's, for example, 10 gigahertz, which means 10 billion hertz. For example, is one of the regions where RadLab was working. That's X-band. And in order to use the radio receivers and the receivers they had to have very, very good oscillators. These oscillators had to have very good amplitude stability and very good frequency stability. And in fact, in RadLab, there was a development by a man named Robert Pound, who was a very famous physicist later on. He's now dead, unfortunately. But he developed a technique in RadLab to stabilize a klystron. Now, what is that? A klystron is one of the kinds of oscillators, transmitters, that were used in RadLab to make it so that you could get, where were the klystrons used? They were used in the receivers that received those signals, those very tiny signals. And what you did is you beat the output of the klystron, which is a frequency at 10 gigahertz, against the incoming signal to make it detectable. That's like it has a fancy name. It's called a super heterodyne radio. And it turns out that it was very difficult to stabilize the klystrons. They were very noisy. Their amplitude was jumping around, and they were very unstable in frequency. And so what Robert Pound did is he figured out a way to make a microwave cavity, which is a box in which the microwaves were bouncing back and forth. And he used that cavity as a reference for the frequency of the klystron. So here's the klystron warbling and making terrible racket in frequency, jumping all over in frequency. Here's this beautiful cavity whose frequency at resonance frequency is determined very carefully by the boundary conditions inside the cavity. It's a chunk of stuff, and it doesn't move much. So consequently, when you inject radio waves into it and you find the resonances in that cavity, you find a very pure, you can only do it with a very pure single frequency of radio frequency. He exploited that. He exploited the fact that you had a cavity and this very noisy klystron, and you could somehow make it so that using the cavity and looking at the signals coming out of it, you could use that in a feedback loop, which means to regulate the frequency of the klystron. And that whole development of making a stable oscillator was something developed in RadLab, and the techniques that were used for klystrons and cavity and radio frequency cavities turn out to be identical to the techniques we are using to stabilize a laser, which the laser is very noisy in frequency as well, and we build optical cavities to do the same thing that Bob Pound did with radio frequencies. So there's a direct connection of frequency stabilization of oscillators in the LIGO project, in the gravitational wave hunt, and it is derived directly from RadLab. And in fact, if you want the fancy name for it, it's called Pound, that's for Bob Pound, Drever, who is the guy in our project, and Pound, Drever, Hall. Hall is he's a Nobel Prize winner at the Joint Institute for Laboratory Astrophysics. And those three, well, they're not together, but Pound developed the technique in RadLab, Drever applied the technique to lasers, and Hall actually provided the lab and some ideas for doing this. And the Pound, Drever, Hall locking scheme or stabilization scheme for lasers is all over LIGO. So that's a second really quite significant connection. And the last one is much broader, and is the last one I can think of. They're probably, if you ask somebody else, they'll probably come up with 10 more connections between RadLab and modern technology. But the one that's very important to us is that we are able to keep, when we detect, for example, this signal of the black holes that I told you about earlier, and you detect them, you find out you need to have very good timekeeping, because you have to have a way of knowing what the time is in one of our sites, which happens to be in Louisiana, and also what the time is exactly relative to the time in Louisiana. You have to know what it is in Washington State, where our other detector is. And so one of the things that we are very, very sensitive to is that we maintain the clock, the basis of clocks. And we do this both by using GPS, which is, of course, a derivative of RadLab. And I think that's been talked about, I hope. But we also do it with making sure that in case GPS isn't keeping good time for us, which can happen, we have atomic clocks at both sites. And they keep time. And so now what's the derivative here? That's the most interesting sort of thing that has changed the whole society. What happened is at RadLab, because for the first time you had stable oscillators at 10 gigahertz, you were able to make cesium clocks. Now cesium is one of the metals, and that's easy to evaporate. You can look at it, it's easy to measure because it's not easy to handle. And it turns out in cesium there is a clock inside of it, and that clock is the nucleus of the nucleus of the cesium atom and the electron, one electron in the cesium atom. They interact with each other, and effectively you can think of it as the nucleus is spinning in the magnetic field of that electron, and that spinning is a very carefully known now and well preserved frequency. It's a particular oscillation, which is the basis of the atomic clock. Okay, and of course the atomic clock is used in GPS because maybe, and it's also used in our instrument. And so there is another connection. That 10 gigahertz was not available. And in fact, RadLab, right at the end of RadLab, Al Hill, who is one of the members of RadLab, and I knew him very well, measured that frequency of the cesium atom in RadLab at the very end, using the equipment that was available in RadLab.
Isn't that what Loran was based on? Was the time?
No, Loran was another clock scheme, but it wasn't as elegant as this. Loran used crystal oscillators, which are not as stable as cesium clocks. But you're right. And now what happens, of course, the world standard for Loran and everything else, all the navigational things that were there, uses atomic clocks, not crystals anymore. Yeah.
But the idea sort of...
Yeah, I mean, you need to look in order to find yourself on the Earth. And that's what the whole idea of GPS is. You need very good clocks. Because how do you find yourself on the Earth? It's very easy. I can tell you how you do it. Loran did it this way. And the Navy developed Loran so they could determine where their boats were on the ocean without seeing land. And the way it works is you have very good clocks stationed in certain places where you know, all around the world, and with antennas. And what you do is you carefully measure the time it takes for pulses from one place, let's say in Africa, another place in Greenland, and another place maybe in Cape Cod, and you triangulate on those pulses, and you can get where you are to a matter of, well, probably, I don't know, Loran was probably not that good. Loran was probably good to probably, my guess is about hundreds of feet, if it was that good. On the other hand, it's GPS, if it isn't corrupted by the destroying signal that the military puts on it, can do down to a few millimeters. Okay?
Wow.
Yeah.
So the cesium, the orbit of the electrons, does it have to be kept at a temperature? Or
No, cesium works at room temperature. That's the joy of it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Let me stop for a second.
Okay, sure.